What's up everyone, Mike here in the BFH Garage. Welcome to the BFH Garage European Edition. Anybody who's been watching my channel for any amount of time knows that I work strictly on Jeep Wranglers. That's my thing, I love doing that. However, if you look behind me here, you're gonna notice that is not a Jeep. I had to make an exception for this one because this one is a special vehicle, I think, and it does deserve a little bit of attention. So we talk about the European Edition. It has to do with this, but it also has to do with some people in my drawing from the big BFH Garage giveaway I just did. So first thing I'm gonna do is give a shout out to the Austrian Rednecks. They were a winner of a couple stickers and stuff like that. Send it out to them. Those guys are awesome. They have their own YouTube channel, Instagram channel, all that stuff. You can go to the website, austrian-redneck.at, and you give those guys a shout out if you go out there. The other person I want to give a shout out to is my friend Freddie in the Scottish Highlands. He also won a sticker. Freddie, this is for you. And for those of you that didn't know, yes, I play bagpipes. I'm Irish, I work for a fire department, those things go together. I play bagpipes for our ceremonial unit and have a blast doing it. So shout out to the Scottish Highlands. For the other people that are here for this thing behind me, let's talk about it right now. What we have here is a 1999 Land Rover Defender TD5 110. And this thing is really, really cool. I'm gonna show you a picture here in a second of what they use them for. This one here is special because it had to wait for the 25-year rule before you can import this type of vehicle to the US. So the owner just took possession of this one in September. He needed help installing an ARB air locker. He's not redoing gears, but we're gonna rebuild the entire differential with new bearings and everything anyway, so it's gonna be the same thing as a re-gear, but we are going to use the gears that are in there. Now, anybody who's watched my channel for any length of time knows I don't like setting up used gears. They're just very finicky. But when you're doing something like this, it's pretty straightforward. If you're just changing out bearings or installing a locker, the tolerances are usually so close that you can change those things out, install them, and they should line up for the most part right away. I can tell you when you're doing backlash on something like this, you are gonna have to move some shims left to right, but I'll go into detail on that stuff here in a little bit. But this thing is pretty darn cool. Land Rover Defender, pulling this thing into my garage. So this is a right-hand drive. You got your steering wheel here. Luckily, the gas and the clutch are on the same side on the footwell there, but the shifter's over here. So try to do this thing and steer it. I'm lucky I didn't drive it out through the backside of my shop. But anyway, we got it in here. We got it on the rack. Let's take a look underneath, see what we have, see what kind of issues we may be facing once we're under there. No idea, but we're going to install an ARB locker for this guy. So come along for the ride. Now that I have this thing in the air, we can take a closer look at it. As you can see, this is a Salisbury axle, which is very similar to the Dana 44. The process is virtually the same. One thing you're going to notice right off the bat is it has all this, it's called wax oil, but it's like a fluid film, and that is to prevent rust. So that might give me some problems trying to get the diff cover off. I'm going to have to kind of scrape and peel, see what we get out of that. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The other thing I noticed right off the bat is you have all these brake lines here that are in the way of removing that diff cover, so I'm going to have to loosen up the connection up top, probably get those kind of out of the way so I can work on this thing. I normally don't use a diff spreader, but in this case I might. I'll figure that out when I get inside. That'll be interesting to see. One of the things I like about these axles is you don't have to take the wheels, the brakes, and all that stuff off to get the axle shafts out. If you come out over here, you're gonna see the end axle cap here that has the 5 bolts. You pull those off and those axle shafts pull straight out. So that does save a little bit of a headache of removing wheels and tires. Normally I like to get the tires and wheels out of the way. It gives me a little bit more room to work, but in this case it doesn't look like it's gonna be too big of an issue. The next thing we want to do is get the drive shaft removed. So we got to get those 4 bolts out. The diff cover bolts were fairly snug with a little bit of rust, corrosion, and that wax oil stuff. This stuff has it on there as well, so we'll see how this stuff comes off. The interesting thing is I'm expecting metrics on all this, and the wrench that fits that's a 9/16, so I thought that was kind of odd. But anyway, let's get that drive shaft off. With the drive shaft out of the way, now we need to remove the axle shafts. This is so nice to not have to remove the wheels and tires to do this. Now, the thing you got to be careful about is that there are seals on the inside here, and you want to try to not damage the seals as you pull this out, as well as put it back in. I know I mentioned earlier that you don't have to take the wheels off to get the axle shafts out, and you don't. However, the other side was stuck pretty good, so I had to take the wheel off so I can get in there and kind of persuade it to come out. So that's neither here nor there. I'm kind of glad I did that, because on the inside of the axle tube here, as you look down towards the carrier, it's kind of like a little valley there, and I peeked down there out of curiosity, and I'm glad I did, because there's a lot of debris down there that I think the magnet's going to pick up and bring out here, and I'll show you. And I just want to get as much of this stuff out as I can. Normally I clean out the axle tubes really good, but because these have that raised center, it's going to be difficult to do. So as you can see right here, that's all the, tune in, there you go. That is all the stuff that came out of the center of that housing right there on the inside. Now, there's more of it in there, so I'm going to spend some time fishing as much of this stuff out as I can. It doesn't really have a metal texture to it. I'm not sure if it's part of an old seal or rust. I don't know exactly what it is. So I'm going to fish out as much of that stuff as I can get out. Before we remove this carrier, we need to take some measurements because we are reusing the ring and pinion. The first thing I want to do is check backlash. As you can see right there, we're sitting right about 10 thou. You want to take your reading from the drive side of the tooth. That's the side that is more horizontal, not the angled side of the tooth. Now, after you establish that, and you saw that we're right about 10 thou, after you establish that, you're going to remove your dial indicator, and you're going to get some marking compound and paint up some ring gear teeth so we can run a pattern. Now, make sure you thin out your ring gear marking compound with a little bit of gear oil, and then you want to paint 3 teeth. Sorry for my big old fat head getting in the way there, but sometimes that's the way it is. Anyway, you only want to put as much paint on these ring gear teeth as it takes to get them covered. Wipe off all the excess that you can. Otherwise, you're going to get too much paint on there, and when you run that pattern, you can get a false reading, because if you put too much marking compound on there, it gets built up in the root. It'll give a harsh line because there's so much of it down there, and you're going to think you're deep when in fact you might not be. So just take that into consideration. Now, as you run this pattern, you need to have some resistance on it. So what I like to do is I take a drill and I put a little socket adapter on there, and I get the socket that fits the pinion nut, and I use that to turn the pinion while I'm holding pressure on the ring gear. And it's really important to hold that pressure on the ring gear, because that puts it under load and it wipes that marking compound off and gives you a very readable pattern. So what you're going to do is you're going to apply pressure to one side, run it, then you're going to apply pressure to the other side. You're going to run that, and then we will interpret the pattern. So now that we've run the pattern, I'm going to rotate the pinion so I can see what the pattern looks like. I can tell you right now, I'm pretty happy with this pattern from the factory. It looks great, both the drive and coast side. So I'm going to take pictures of this pattern so that way I have something to reference when we install the ARB air locker. Now understand, because the ARB goes in with the seal housing a little bit different, more than likely, in
fact, almost guaranteed we're going to have to change shims from side to side to make sure we can get back to our original backlash somewhere near 10 thou. We'll talk about that more later when that time comes. So I'll post up some pictures of what this pattern looks like. Now it's time to remove the carrier, but before we do so, we need to take a look at these bearing caps because these bearing caps are machined with this housing. That means they need to go in a specific way when you put things back together. The left side needs to stay on the left side, the right side needs to stay on the right side, and then the orientation of up and down also matters. Now, most bearing caps are marked, but if they're not, what you can do is you could put, what most people will do is they'll put a punch mark on the left cap, one on the housing, and then they'll put 2 punch marks on the right cap, and then 2 punch marks on the face of the housing there. And they'll do it to the top side. That way they know which side is up and down and which side is left to left. Now, as you look at these bearing caps right here, you're going to see some letters that correspond to the housing mark. So I have a letter that is horizontal, one that's vertical, but anyways, you look at that, they correspond to what's marked on the housing, and that shows you exactly how these bearing caps go back in. Now, the right one there is showing that it's vertical, the left one's showing horizontal, and it's as simple as that. As long as you have that reference, you put those bearing caps back in the exact same way, everything will be just fine.
Now it's time to get the carrier out, but remember I talked about these brake lines. We have to get these up out of the way. One of the things when I pulled the diff cover off, I realized that the brake line here is attached at this point up here, and it can be lifted above. Pop it out of this clip, pop it out of that clip, and the whole thing gets kind of springy. You can move it out of the way. I want to make sure I don't bend it too far or anything like that and create a break, but that is great because it gets it completely out of my way, and we're going to be good to go. So now I need to get the 4 bearing cap bolts off. Understand when you are taking these bearing cap bolts off, this carrier may or may not be in there tight, and if it's not in there tight and you pull off the carrier cap bolts and you're not ready for it, this entire thing can come down, smashing down to the ground on your feet or whatever the case may be. So the way I like to do this is I start with the left side first, then I can hold it here, get the right side. When those are off, I'm going to give it a feel to see what it feels like before I ever let go of this hand to make sure that it's not going to crush me. So I want to make sure that's not going to fall out. That thing's got great preload in there. So this thing was set up great. This entire diff, everything about it feels great. The pattern's great. I love that that's the case. So now in order to get this, let me get a rag to wipe my hands off. So to remove the carrier, the open end wrench goes on a carrier bolt, a ring gear bolt. And then what you're going to do is you're going to rotate the pinion until it captures this. Now the bolt or the wrench here is attached to the bolt here, which is pushing up against this. When you turn your pinion, sometimes they come out easy, sometimes they don't. So have a socket with the pinion nut set up to the right size. And again, you're going to be holding everything here to make sure it doesn't come crashing out. The goal is to get it started to come out. So if you turn this, you can see how it starts to come out. Now you got to be very careful because you don't want to go too far and have it come crashing down on you. So I'm going to hold it here. I'm going to get this wrench off of there. And now I can pull this the rest of the way out. Sometimes they're still a little bit tough to get out, so you're going to have to just kind of work it. And sure shit, this one's going to be that way. So one of the things you can do is you can get a little screwdriver in there and start to wiggle it out that way. So that's what I'm going to do to get this thing out. We'll get it over on the bench. The other part of this that's really key is make sure you have a spot for this to go. I have a little table right here, so if I need to set it down for a second, I can do it right here. But then over on my workbench, I have a spot already picked out for this to set it down. So fairly straightforward. You see how it's starting to come loose right there? So now I want to be able to catch it, and out it comes. Now with the carrier out, it's time to get the pinion out. If you are simply installing an air locker and not changing gear ratios or anything like that, if your pinion bearing's in good shape, you can leave this alone. You can leave this thing exactly as it is, install your locker, go on down the road. But the first thing I would say to do is kind of rotate this by hand. You see how one feels kind of snug right there? You see how it's not, it has to have a little bit of a breakaway there? I'm not going to say that it feels notchy, but it's not 100% smooth the way I would like it. So I'm going to opt to take this one out, and it's good preventative maintenance anyway. We're going to put a new pinion seal in there. We're going to get a new crush sleeve in there. I believe these use crush sleeves, and we're going to get that all set up, and it's going to be a new bearing. So that'll match the new bearings on the locker, and then everything will wear down at the same time versus this wearing down later on down the road and it becoming a bigger issue. So the best way to get these things off, if you don't have an impact wrench, they make a flange tool that you can bolt to this and use a breaker bar. That is more work than I'd ever want to do. So I get my big old Milwaukee, pull this thing right off. Now what I'll do is I'll leave it a couple threads on. That way, when I go to punch this pinion out, it doesn't fall to the ground, because again, we're reusing this pinion. I don't want it to fall to the ground. So leave a couple of threads on there. I'm going to get my center punch. On the back side of the pinion, there's a little indentation there for this reason. You take this and you just start pushing it through, and then you're going to see how everything becomes loose. So I'll do that, get the nut off the rest of the way, and now I'm going to hold the pinion gear because I do not want it to fall out the other side. So for these that have been on there for a while, be prepared that the stem may go beyond what your nut can hold. So you're going to have to try to hold this, and you still can't get this off. If you have another hammer ready, such as this, you can kind of work it until it comes apart. There we go. Good Lord. Bring the pinion out through the backside. There's your collapsible spacer. We'll put it right there. And we'll go from there. Next up, we're going to need to take out that seal. I'll show you how to do that right now. All right, they make a tool specifically for this called a seal puller. Imagine that. Anyway, when you put this thing up in here, you need to be careful, because if you go all the way behind the seal, you could actually be touching the inside of the housing here. And if you go to rip this seal out like that, you could put a nice gouge right inside the housing there. And that could lead into problems of your pinion seal leaking. So I take it, I put it back there, make sure I drop it back just a little bit so I'm not catching the housing, and then I start to pull it out slowly, because you're probably going to tear these things. What you're going to do, oh, well, every time I say something, it always comes out the opposite. But anyway, there's your pinion seal outside of that housing now. That gives you access to the tail bearing here.
With the pinion out, the tail bearing removed, the seal removed, now it is time to remove the races. The races are, they're set inside the housing. You have to use a race driver to get those things set. If you can see where my finger's pointing right now, there's a little bit of a lip that extends beyond the housing, and that is what you're going to use to punch these races out. You have just that little bit of a lip, and you have to work around in a circular fashion as you're punching these things out. And you want to make sure you're not going to hit the housing, or you could break or damage that housing. So make sure you're feeling that you're only on the lip. I use this big old bar right here that's flat, round on one side. I get my BFH and I start tapping this out in a circular fashion until the thing pops out. Pretty straightforward. You'll see it start to come out, or you'll feel it come out, and then you just keep working in that circular fashion until the thing pops right out.
Now, if you've never set up gears before, the way this works, either behind the pinion head, get this bearing over here. So either behind the pinion head, between the bearing and the pinion head, there's going to be some shims. In this case here, I punched out the inner race, and lo and behold, there's a shim behind that inner race. These shims are key to identifying what your starting point needs to be when you're doing new gears. So make sure you account for all these shims that either popped out, maybe fell in your bucket. If they rolled around, you want to locate all of those, because that's really, really important to setting your pinion depth the exact same as what it came out. So that'll be my starting point, and we'll figure it out from there. I should be able to use the exact same shim, put it back in there, and that pinion depth should be perfect, albeit with new bearings. So with that being said, this housing is now completely empty from everything that needs to be removed. Now I can clean it thoroughly and get it ready to start doing some work. But before I do that, if you look right here, Salisbury housings, some of them, you're going to see this little nub right here. That will interfere with the ARB. So when you do your research on doing these things, you'll learn that certain things come into play. And in this case here, the ARB will interfere with this. So what we need to do is ground this nub down. I'll get a flap disc in here, get it down, and then it'll be good. Now, the other thing that you need to make sure that you have, and this one does, thank God, this is the first axle I've ever seen have it, are these little slots cut out right here. These are so gear oil can go out, lubricate the bearings, but also have a return slot for it to come back down into the diff housing here. These already have them on both sides, so that's one step that I don't have to do. If yours does not have these little slots ground in right here, and they're maybe that thick is all, and you make them flush to the housing here, a trick you can do is take a little Dremel tool with a cutoff wheel. You're going to cut a bunch of little slices, and eventually you'll work them down to where you can get the entire slot cleaned up in there. Just make sure when you're done, you clean out this housing thoroughly with brake clean, get all of that grinding dust out of there. You don't need that stuff getting up all in your new bearings and all that stuff. So these are done, no problem. This one I have to remove, and then I'm going to clean this housing. Do you remember when I was talking about the stuff that was in the axle tubes? Take a look at this. That is all the stuff that's been coming out of the axle tubes. To me, it either looks like rust or gold, and I'm about ready to break out my gold pan and take a look here, but my guess is it's probably a little bit of rust on the inside of the tubes, or maybe even mud. It has that, when you pick it up and touch it, it's kind of got a rust feel to it. It could be dirt, I suppose. But anyway, that's the stuff I'm trying to get out of the tubes right now. So I want to make sure this axle housing is completely clean. The oil gallery, all that, you want all that stuff clean before you start doing anything else. So what I want to do now is pull these bearings. I don't have to because we're not reusing the carrier, but I want to pull them just so I can see what the starting stack for my shims will be for that ARB. Since we're using the OEM bearings, I want to see what that starting stack's going to be on each side, because if I can get that, that'll get me pretty darn close to what I need to be when I go for that final install. I'm not changing gears. Everything else should be relatively the same. So if I can figure out what these starting stacks are, let's say it's, I don't know, 42 on this side, then I can get the ARB shims, make a shim stack of 42 and put it with the ARB. The thing is, the ARB shims go outside of the bearings. Stock, they come underneath the bearings. So I need to pull these to see what my starting stack's gonna be. Boy, does this thing make quick work of it. I love this clamshell puller. So the bearing's off. I'll clean that up, I'll inspect that. I'm just curious about the general wear. And then here, you can see the shims come off undamaged. I can get an idea of how, of what the shim thickness is. I'll clean them all up, I'll measure them, and I'll have that figured out. I want to make sure though, I mark this for what it is, turn it over, mark the other one for which side it is, so I'm not getting them mixed up. So that's it on this side. Now I'm going to turn over and do the other side. All right, I've got the housing clean, as you can see. All of that grit and stuff's out of the tubes, everything's set up nicely. One of the things I need to do now though, is I need to figure out where my ARB bulkhead fitting is gonna be. Now the bulkhead fitting is going to take the copper hose from the seal housing. The seal housing sits over here on this side of the ARB, goes up and over the ring gear, and we're gonna punch it out somewhere over here. Now, obstacles I'm working with, I have the brake line bracket here, and it's got a bunch of stuff up top, so I can't just put it right through there because that bracket will probably interfere with anything I'm trying to do here. So let me get this up out of the way here. One of the first things I do is I insert this side's bearing cap so I can see what I have to work with here. If I don't have this here and I drill in right there, I'm gonna regret that later on, obviously. So put the bearing cap here, and then I'm feeling behind here. Now understand there's you have the face here that has a raised lip, and you go in about 1 inch, and then there's another raised lip. So I have a little valley that I have to fit into, which does present its own challenges as well. But if I feel back here, I feel a nice flat spot. Right about here, there's a big bump. So it's flat, and then there's a little ridge that you have to go up and over. And I don't want to drill onto that ridge because that's not going to be a great spot for that bulkhead fitting. So feeling back here, I've determined a spot that's just offset a little bit to this side of this bolt hole here, but it goes back and will make a great spot for that bulkhead fitting. So it'll be right back here somewhere. And instead of coming at an angle like this, I'm probably gonna drill the hole a little bit more up and down. And the reason for that is access back here is pretty tough to get a drill your hole. I don't want to remove the axle if I don't have to. And drilling it on this angle versus 90 degrees to it isn't going to change anything as far as the way that thing fits or strength or anything like that. It'll be strictly for access. And then the other nice thing about it is it'll come out straight this way, or maybe off a little bit camber that way. And then I can run that line right up along that brake line through the body, wherever it needs to go to get to that compressor. So I'm going to go ahead and drill this out. Again, I'm going to clean up the housing again after I get all these shavings drilled out and tapped. All this will get re-cleaned, and then we're ready to start the install process for the gears and the locker. So this is what's up next. I'll take a picture of this right here so you can see what I'm talking about. So on this Salisbury axle here, you can see what I'm talking about, how you have this little valley. I got a big ridge on this backside. I got the big lip on this side. And then you can see, hopefully you can see right here where I have that big raised section. I don't want to drill on top of that. So I've made the decision to, I don't even know if you can see the hole I started, but I'm gonna be drilling right there. So it'll be centered between those two ridges. The bulkhead will fit down in there. You can do that with the socket. And then all the other fittings that come up over the top that you need to tighten up, you can do with an open head wrench. You can probably still squeeze an open head wrench in there to hold it while you're tightening the others, but that's kind of the challenge of this design right here. Is I can certainly get something down in there, becomes a little bit more involved to get a wrench on it. Now, with that being said, could I come all the way back here, this big open flat spot? Yeah, I probably could. However, this I like because it gives a little bit of protection from it, from everything tweaking around and all that. And it's just a good spot when you're running that over. You don't want to run your airline too far in because then you're trying to still clear that ring gear and you don't want that copper line getting caught up in that. So it would work. I just like that better. The ARB bulkhead fitting hole has been drilled and tapped. I'm going to clean that up with a little file right there. But when you do this, it pays dividends to put in a paper towel like that. That way all your shavings go right to the towel. It makes your cleanup afterwards much easier. With the housing all cleaned up, the bulkhead port already tapped, everything's done there. I'm going to now move on to setting the ring up on the ARB air locker here. Now, before I go into details on that, I just want you to notice how I keep everything in a clean and orderly fashion here. When you watch my other re-gear videos, I talk about how important that is because it's easy to lose pieces or mix them up with other parts, and then you're spending all your time finding them, or you set a pinion gear on top of a shim and you bend it and you didn't realize it. So maintaining organization is key. People who work in shops, they have these little carts they use underneath there. They have all their shims. You know what? They do it that way because it's easier for them for high volume work. So here in my shop, you know what? I like to take my time, make sure these things are done right, so I get everything organized just like this. Now, my ring gear is already in the oven, so the whole point behind that is when you go to put a ring gear on a carrier or a locker, it is such a tight fit around here, it just won't slide right over. So if you're not familiar with metals, when you heat them up, they expand. When you cool them, they shrink. So this has been out in the shop. It's a little bit chilly out here, not bad. But the ring gear is in the oven at 200 degrees, probably 15 minutes is all it's gonna take. I'm gonna bring it back out. I'll set it right over this locker. It'll slide right down. Take the ring gear bolts, put them from the back side, and start cinching that thing down. You don't want to take a torch and heat up your ring gear. That can damage it. And you don't want to take your ring gear, just set it on here and use the bolts to draw it down. The problem with that is if you use the bolts to draw it down, it can kind of get cockeyed and then it gets really tough to move. And you may think it's on all the way and it may not be. And then you're going to have a wobbly ring gear. It's just far, far easier. Put it in the oven. Don't tell your wife, but put it in the oven, bring it back out, put it on your locker, secure it. It's real simple. Before I set the ring gear on top of the ARB, I'm going to take my red Loctite, make sure my bolts get plenty of that on there. I'm going to tell you what, you can reuse ring gear bolts, not recommended, but you can. The key to that is you need to 100% clean them. Get the brake clean in there, get all that old Loctite off. And I mean, get them clean, get them dry. You don't want these things to ever back out because they will cause a lot of damage when they do. So make sure you get those thoroughly clean. Same thing with the ring gear on the back side here. When you clean up the ring gear, if you're going to reuse it, you got to go through all of those holes. Even on a new ring gear, I go through every hole because they'll have that packing grease on there, and I'll clean up everything very, very good. So this one barely fits right now, which is good. Get my holes lined up. Right there, and then you can start two, one on each side. Make sure those holes are lined up. And then just draw enough to hold up the ring gear. That's all I need right there. Now you can go through, insert all the other bolts. And I always finger start them. I don't want to let the impact try to do that because if you cross threads, it becomes an issue. When you go to torque these things down, you'll notice that I put a number sequence there, and you're just kind of going in a triangle here, then you rotate, and you keep doing that around the clock, and then it'll draw everything evenly and make sure that ring gear is set perfectly. Now that we have the ring gear securely fastened to the ARB, it is time to move over to the shop press and press the bearings on. Now remember, we're dealing with an ARB air locker here, so when we install it, the shims go to the outside of the bearings. So we can press these bearings on, and we're done. We don't need to move any bearings on and off to make any adjustments. So that makes that part nice. Now, if you're reinstalling a OEM carrier where the shims came from underneath the bearings, it gives you a couple of options depending on the install kit you have. Sometimes they give you shims that go underneath the bearing. Other times they give you shims that go outside the bearing. It's fine. It works either way. You can still make your adjustments. The main difference being is when you go to install that carrier, if you have shims to the outside, it is absolutely critical to keep them even with the race. So you want them even with the race. Once they start getting off like that, pull your carrier back out and try to reseat it. It's real easy to bend shims that way, but it does make it easier to just press on bearings and not have to pull them on and off to make your adjustments. Another thing you can do if you're going to make adjustments using an OEM carrier is to make what's called setup bearings. I highly, highly recommend that you do not use used bearings or used races. Buy the exact same type of bearing, same brand and everything, and that way that'll give you the best chance for success. You're going to take the bearing, you're going to hone out the inside here. You can use a Dremel with the sanding drum in there. Just keep going around in circles. Make sure you stay as even as possible. Other people use a honing tool that can do that. Either way, you just want to remove enough material that this bearing will just slide over as a slip fit. You don't want it so loose that it moves back and forth. You want it to be a perfect slip fit over that. And then when you need to make adjustments, you can slide those bearings right off, change your shim stack, put the bearing right back on until you get it dialed in. Once you get it dialed in, you pull off your setup bearing, leave the shims in place, and you can press on your final bearings and move forward that way. So that's the way that goes. Let's move over to the press and get these things pushed on. Once you get your press all set up, always take some grease, put it on the inside of this. It's going to make it go on a lot easier, and it keeps it from corroding and bonding to that if you ever need to take it off again. So if you're going to notice here, the side I have up is the seal housing side. And I always do that with ARBs because the bearing presses all the way down and it still leaves a little bit of that journal facing up. And when you go to turn it over and press on the other side, then you're not pressing on the bearing itself and damaging that cage. So I always start by pressing this side first. Take an old race from one of the carrier bearings and you're going to put that there. And as you go to press, then your cage is going to roll around freely. Take a piece of scrap, whatever you have that can help press that on. Put that there perfectly center. While we're here, we might as well get the pinion bearing pressed on. So take your bearing, make sure you put a thin layer of grease inside there so that way it goes on nice and easy. Make sure when you put this thing on, it is oriented in the correct direction. Worst thing you ever want to see is put it on that way, realize you have backwards, you got to buy a new bearing. So take it, put it like that. What I do is I take an old cone that is the same size as the bearing here. Make sure it's either cracked or has that cut in it, and what that does, that allows it to expand as it goes over that journal. Because as you press this thing on, this is going to press on with it, and you can just take a screwdriver, twist it a little bit, and this will pop right off. Otherwise, you're going to have to get a clamshell puller to pull that off. So this makes it nice and easy. We're going to turn it upside down just like that. You can see I have the crack there. I want to make sure everything's lined up perfectly. That moves around. We're going to put our little spacer in here, and then we're going to press that on. Now that we have all the bearings on the locker as well as the pinion, it is time to put in the tail bearing race. Now this thing doesn't come back out. There's no shims that go behind it. So the one thing you want to make sure is that everything is cleaned out of that seat in the backside. You don't want any bit of foreign anything to get in there, because if you do, it can throw your race off and then things don't sit the way they should. So get in there, take a good look, make sure everything's the way it needs to be. Take some grease, put on the outside of the race here. We're going to set it in just like that. And then you take your bearing driver, you put it in there, and you drive it home. When you hit the bottom of this thing, when you bottom out, you'll hear a distinct ping. Right there. Okay, remember we're using used gears, so the pinion depth should be exactly the same. I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to take the original shim stack. I'm going to set it in there. And we're going to put the final race in there. Now that's kind of a, I would call it a, taking a chance on that could happen, but I'm kind of in a pickle here because this Salisbury axle, it takes that different carrier and all that. I don't have any shims that go behind the race on the inside. I do have shims I could put between the pinion head and the bearing, but I'm going to take my chances. I'm going to put these shims in there with this race. I'm going to drive it in, and then we're going to check our depth and see what it looks like. And if the pinion depth is off for some reason, then I'll have to make adjustments at the pinion head. If I don't have a small enough shim to put behind the pinion head and the bearing, then I'll probably have to drive this race back out, source some shims for it, and then continue from there. That'd really suck because this thing would be stuck on my lift. I have other work I need to get done, but sometimes that's just the way this game goes. Yeah, we'll take our chances and see what happens. With both races in, now it's time to get the pinion in, and we're going to get it set for our initial run. Note here on your nuts, your pinion nuts here, I take the old nut and I make what's called a setup nut. So these nuts, when they're brand new, they're designed to kind of cut into the threads for clamping and holding power. So I take a little Dremel on the inside with a sanding drum, and I just take the sharp edges off the threads, clean it all up, and then I put grease on there. You don't want to put grease on there for final setup, but I put grease on here so that way it slides past without cutting the threads. And then when you go to put your final nut for final install on, then you want to take some brake clean, get all that grease off of there, and then actually red Loctite it. So for setup, and especially when using used gears, they've already been insulted once by the threads. You want to make sure everything slides nice and calm there and not tear it up for setup. So we're going to take this from the back side here. We're going to put it through, kind of help it, make sure everything spins good. It does. You're going to take your inner pinion bearing. Don't put in the crush sleeve yet. Crush sleeve is only for final install. You're going to put in your inner pinion bearing there. Then you're going to take your flange. You're going to start that, and this one I can tell you already is going to be a booger. So then you got to take a hammer and you have to influence it until you get some thread showing. Once you get thread showing, you can start that nut and then take your impact and tighten it down. Now here's where you got to be careful. As you're impacting this, it's going to be sucking that bearing on. So that bearing on the inside is not a, doesn't need to be pressed on with the shop press. It's a press fit by the flange here. So as I take my impact, start driving, it's going to start moving that bearing on. Now without having that crush sleeve in there, you got to be really careful because you can overdo it and crush your bearings. You want resistance on this, and you want to mimic the resistance of spec. In this case here, I'll probably shoot for about 20 inch-pounds just to make sure it's nice and snug so I can run a pattern. But you see how it's not even close to being there yet. Always check. Still not enough. Make sure my settings turned up right. There we go. That's a little bit too tight. Not enough to crush the bearing, but that was just a little bit too much preload. I'll probably have to tighten that back up just a little bit to get my preload. So anyway, you get the gist. I'll take my punch and make sure that that pushes back out. I'll reset it, get my preload where it needs to be. Then we could throw in the locker and start looking for backlash. Now that we're ready to install the actual ARB, we have to decide what our starting shim stacks are going to be. So I had my old numbers over here on each side. I threw some shims together to get close to those numbers. I just want to take a look and see where we're at. So I have two shim stacks here, one that's going to go on the seal housing side, one that's going to go on the other side. But before we do that, what I need to do is take the ARB O-rings and get those installed so that way this thing sits on the journal correctly. Now when you go to install these O-rings, let me come show you here. These are not round type O-rings. When you look at these, come on, focus, there you go. You can see how they're square. They're not round in a sense like you'd expect a regular O-ring. So it's critical that when you install these, you make sure that they are installed flat and do not have a twist in them or anything like that. So when you go to install these, take some gear oil, put a liberal amount between your fingers there, rub it around really good. You want this O-ring to have plenty of gear oil in there for when it goes onto the journal. That keeps them from turning dry, and that could, if you run them dry, you could create a tear or premature wear. So again, the other one, we're going to add a liberal amount of oil here, rub it around the entire O-ring just like this, and we're going to install it. You're pushing it in, and when you get to the echo, timer off. When you get to the end here, you can see how you get that big old lump. You just got to kind of work it in there until it goes in and seats. Now verify as you do this that those seals are in there nice and square and not twisted. All right, if you've never installed an ARB before, like I said, you always double check all of your bearing seats and all that stuff, make sure there's nothing on there. Now, when you go to put your seal housing onto the locker itself, you're going to take your shims on the inside here and you're going to get them all lined up where they need to go. And when you put it on the end of the journal, you want to rock it back and forth to get those bearings, or not the bearings, you want to get the seals to slide over the journal without twisting. It's really important you pay attention to what you're doing there because it's easy to get them twisted. If you do that, you're going to create all sorts of problems and not even realize it. So you want to make sure you get that. There we go. The other thing you want to do is get your copper line unraveled and away from the housing, so when you go to put this thing in there, you aren't knocking it around and bending it, or even worse, breaking it. So that copper line is going to ride right up in this area here. It will come up and around and come out my bulkhead fitting hole there. But for setup, I'm going to have it kind of sticking straight out. That way I can adjust anything I need to adjust as I'm knocking this carrier in. So this carrier is a heavy SOB in these Defenders here, so gotta get it up there and get it started. You see how the shims on this side, you want to keep them all even because I have some thin shims over there and you don't want to bend those shims. So it's imperative that as you're installing this thing, that you keep those shims together. Now, because of the nature of preload, I have, oh, I gotta pull it back out. Gosh dang it. All right, well, okay, here's a lesson for you to learn. So, as you're gonna see here, I have my thin shims to the outside. And what that is going to do is create a bending hazard for that shim. You always wanna have your thickest shims to the outside. They're going to press up against the others. In fact, if you can take and sandwich them in between, so put your thin shims in between the others, now I have a third on each side, a 10 in the middle there. Now I can put it up there and have those shims sandwich. So pay attention to little things like that. I got it backwards somehow. Let's try this again. This thing reminds me when I was doing it 8.8. 8.8s are, when you're doing them this high off the ground, those things are unbelievable. All right, so I gotta try to get it in this seat here. Okay, so now it won't go any further, which is telling me that my preload is going to be decent for now. I need to check it, but it's not gonna just fall out because I'm already having to try to push this in. So you take your hammer, you start working it, real lightly work those shims. You don't wanna bend those shims. Now you see how shims start to go. Okay. So I can't pull that out by hand even right now, so that's good. I need to get my shim driver, put those in the rest of the way, and then we're gonna see what that backlash is at. Now that I have the shims caught up, I wanna beat on this thing and make sure that it is seated all the way. I can't pull it out. Now, you want to take your bearing caps, put those on. First of all, make sure you have a little bit of backlash. So I do. It sounds like it might be a bit much, but we'll see. You want to take your bearing caps, put those on. I'll show you how I do it here in a second. You're going to hear some people talk about how you can put these things on finger tight and that's good enough. The one thing I've learned setting up gears for the last, I don't know how many years, is that I tend to get inconsistent readings if I don't tighten the bolts up to a certain tightness. So, for example, on this one here, I take my drill, clutch is set, and that's as tight as it needs to be. Now you notice before I start tightening these down, I give it that good kick right there, and that helps to seat the bearing cap on the race and it doesn't get cockeyed. Now we can check backlash. Yeah, that sounds like it's going to be a bit much, but let's just see where we're at. You never know. Set my dial indicator there. Again, when you set these dial indicators, you want the catch the flat side of the tooth. Yeah, see, I'm not even hitting it there. I got to adjust it still. You want to catch a flat side of the tooth. All right, what is your problem? There you go. And that's going to give a true reading right there. So when I take this and I go like this, I'm looking at my reading and I'm at, 16, almost 17 on my backlash. That's too much backlash. So what I need to do is pull the locker back out. I'm going to take shims from this side, move them over to this side, which is going to make the ring gear get closer to the pinion gear. It's real easy to get that mixed up, so you got to pay attention to that. So I'm going to take shims from this side, move them to this side, and that's going to push everything this way because the pinion gear lines up right about here. That allows the ring gear to go into the pinion gear just a little bit more until we can get that correct backlash. So everything's got to come back out. We're going to move those shims. Got my shims changed from side to side. Everything's reset. My bearing caps are tight. I have my dial indicator in place. And we are showing 11 thousandths of backlash. We pulled it out with 10 thousandths of backlash. If anything, I'd rather be at 9 thousandths than 11 thousandths because that allows for a little bit of bearing break-in. I'm trying to see if I can get a 1,000th change here. I believe I have 2 3,000 shims in the seal housing that I could swap out for a boy, I'm gonna have to do some math and see if I can do this with the shims I have. So if I do it that way, that's actually opened it up a little bit more. So I may swap a 5 for a 3 and see where that gets me. We'll be right back. This is just so you know, this is part of the agonizing part of setting up gears. This thing has to come in and out over and over and over until you get things dialed perfectly. A lot of people run it right where I'm at right now because it's as close to the 10,000 as you could probably expect, but I'm going to play with this a little bit more and see what I can come up with. Now, with my shims where they're at, like I said, I moved the 2000s. I am at 8 thou back. All right, you get done with that. Our pattern's right there. Look at that. Interesting. Pretty darn close to the pattern that was in there, doesn't it? Oh boy, I'm gonna have to compare patterns. That actually looks really, really good compared to what was in there, but the pattern looks almost identical. And again, when those bearings start to wear in just a little bit, it's going to open back up towards that, 9-10 thousandth range. So that's going to be perfect. I'm going to leave it right there. So now what we have to do is final pinion setup. So going back to that, that's another point I wanted to make. So I took my chance in here on using the previous pinion depth that was in there because we didn't change gears. It should work, and it in fact works. So I don't have to take out a setup race or anything like that. It's already set. Second, but let's get this flange off of here, get the pinion out, and start getting this thing set up. So listen up, this part is really, really important. You want to be very, very organized in this step of the process because if you're not and you forget something, then you're gonna need a new seal or a new crush sleeve. You just gotta pay attention to what you're doing. That way you don't have to start all over by going to get new parts and all that. So the very first thing I do is I take my pinion and I take over there on the my table, I have gear oil. I put gear oil around there, rub it in real good. That way this pinion's not going to dry the first time that it is in the housing. The very next thing I do is I take the crush sleeve, the new crush sleeve, and I put it right on the pinion. That way I do not forget that it's there. Now our next step is we need to get the seal in this housing. So before we do that, let me come over there and show you what I'm talking about here. You want to take some grease and pack the lip of that seal because right back in there, there's a little spring that retains that seal around the pinion. You want to make sure that thing's not going to go anywhere. Plus, you want to get a little bit of a packing on that lip so that way the seal rides not dry on the flange journal there. So I also have grease over here, and when I put the journal through the seal, it'll wipe it right back to where it needs to be. I just want to make sure there's plenty of grease where it needs to be. Now, before I put the seal in, you want to make sure you take the tail bearing and just set it there. It's not going to stay too good by itself, but it'll stay right there. And that's when we want to install the seal. Now, with that being said, the seals are different depending on which application you're going to look for. In this case here, you can see this seal has this rubber lip that sticks out right there. So try to take a hammer here and get this thing started is going to be a little bit of a bear to get that done. So what I've done is I've gone over to my bucket of races. I found a race that fits perfectly around that, and I could slowly begin to tap in this seal. Now you have to be careful because it's going to want to sit cockeyed. You got to find the sweet spot to get it started. So once you start getting that going, just start working around in a circular fashion. And you don't want to hammer hard for two reasons. Number one, you can break the seal. Number two, you can knock that spring off the backside. With the seal flush to the snout, now I'm going to take my pinion and I'm going to push it through. You need to be really careful because the tip of the pinion needs to come through the bearing, but the last thing you want to do is push up against the seal and start to push it out. So that bearing is going to be a little bit snug trying to go out. This is where you can damage a seal. You remember how I had to take my dead blow hammer to start this thing until I got to threads? Well, that's going to happen again right here, and it's a little bit tricky. You want to push that bearing, the pinion head bearing right into the race, and you want to hold as tight as you possibly can while you get that started. Get enough threads to where you can start. And then we're going to start driving this flange onto the pinion threads there. Really important that you hold these as tight as you can, as still as you can, because that seal is going to be moving as you do this. You see how it started moving in? So I still have a little bit of play, but we're getting close. So I'm going to tighten this up, and then I'm going to swap over to that other final nut. All right, I'm not going to lie, this thing about kicked my ass, and it was a tough one to get, but I got it there. So I keep getting it to the point where I can turn it, I can feel my preload on it, and you get to a certain point and you want to check. So you take your inch-pounds torque wrench, it has to be beam style, and you put on there, and you're looking for the rotational force, not the breakaway force. So even if it takes like 30 inch-pounds to break away, it's whatever it's turning at is the measurement you want to get. So in this case here, I'm constantly turning, and I'm right at that 18 inch-pounds setting. So that's perfect for what I'm looking for right now. Now it's time to move back, get that locker installed, and yeah, we'll run another pattern, make sure everything stayed the same. You want to make sure this thing is completely seated, no doubt about it. Can't pull it out by hand. We have good preload. In fact, every time I've pulled it out, I had to use the wrench trick to get it out. That thing's in there really, really good. So the thing we need to pay attention to now is this copper line. This copper line has to get worked over and out through the bulkhead fitting over there. The thing I'm going to be working against right now is going to be the ARB diff cover. What I mean by that, stay tuned, is this cover is massive, and the problem is, you can see right here I have this little dun-dun-dun thing right here that could affect that line if I'm outside the plane of the housing there. So I got to kind of get this line tucked up a little bit, have it go back and around up through there, and that is going to keep it safe. So I need to see where my bearing cap fits and adjust the line accordingly if I can. So I'm going to end up having to bend it up. And I'm going to try to follow this ridge right here all the way up and over, and then we'll figure out where I need to cut it. We'll get it cut, we'll get it cleaned up, and then I'll show you how to set the bulkhead fitting in the housing there. Before we start to profile this and get this thing set in place, first thing we need to do is torque our our bearing cap bolts. And the reason you want to do that is when you start to bend this over and work it over here, there's probably not going to be room behind that bolt to do so. So get in there, get that torque to spec, and then we can start profiling the airline. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to take this bulkhead fitting right here and get it into the threaded portion of the axle housing. But before you do that, you need to put some thread sealant on these threads. I'm a big fan of this blue thread sealant. You don't want to get it on anywhere besides the threads, but this stuff will firm up and kind of cure. Still is removable, but it makes for a really good thread sealant, and does a great job. I really like this stuff. So you're going to find your little hole up here, start it, hopefully, and then you can snug it to where it's just snug. You don't want to over tighten those. Those things can break fairly easily. You just want to get it to where it's snug. Okay, this next part is pretty important. I have a separate ARB bulkhead fitting video, but it's really simple here. This connection here gets made by the use of 2 rubber O-rings. So one O-ring will go this copper line, first of all, gets pushed through the bulkhead fitting. You're going to install one rubber O-ring, then a spacer, then another rubber O-ring, and then you're going to have this little cap fitting on top that goes in. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my first rubber O-ring. You can see that I just lathered that in some gear oil, and you want to do that so it slides on nice and easy. But first we need to get this line up through the fitting. There we go. And you got to push up and out of the fitting. So you have to have enough line to do that. And then you're going to bring your rubber O-ring and you are going to use your finger and roll it onto the copper line. That way it does not tear. Once you get that rubber O-ring on, you're going to take this little spacer here. You are going to then put the spacer on, push that down a little bit, make room for the next rubber O-ring. You're going to grab the next rubber O-ring, you're going to roll it on just like you did the first without tearing it. Can't quite see. There we go. And then you're going to let that push down a little bit. Now, what comes into play is going to be this little fitting right here. It has that Phillips screwdriver slot little thing there. And you're going to start that into the top side of that bulkhead fitting. Once you get the threads going on that, first of all, make sure you're not cross-threaded, all right? Once you get the threads going on that, you can take a screwdriver and start working it in. Now, as you're starting to tighten that up, it's going to want to push down on this. So you want to make sure you back this up into that because you want to keep the O-rings and the spacer connected up against that little bit of that fitting. So just start working it down. You'll see how it starts pushing it down as I continue to tighten up. Could have probably used a smaller screwdriver. So as it gets to that point, you're going to feel it start to snug up. Hopefully. There we go. And then you're going to give it about another eighth to a quarter turn. There we go. That's snug right there. So you see how this thing is firm and it's not moving, not coming out. I can take it, I can pull on this thing and it's not moving. So that is good in that sense that it's secure there, but now we have to profile the rest of this line. So I have to start bending this line a little bit, making sure that I'm clearing the ring gear especially, but getting everything else over to where it runs up to there where it's not going to hit anything. So it's just going to be a matter of forming this line to fit. The one thing you have to make 100% certain is very little space between your bearing cap in this line and then very little space between the line and the actual housing where the seal housing presses against. It's very common to grind out a groove in your bearing cap, just a little bit of a groove to allow the copper line to not rub up against the bearing cap. What happens is if you don't fit this right and you just let it lean up against a bearing cap or leave it in the ring gear tooth area where it can go by, it'll grab it, tear it apart. Over here, what happens over time, vibration from driving, the copper line will sit there and oscillate against the bearing cap and it will eventually wear through the copper, creating a hole. So you want to make sure from the seal housing, nothing is touching anywhere and you have enough room to account for any type of vibration that you may get through here. So all I'm going to do now is go ahead and form this line, get it set where I want. And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to run a pattern again, make sure we're good. All right, I've double checked my profiling for my ARB line here. You really have to get into this area and make sure that you have, it's going to be a very tiny gap. But in this case here, I ground down the bearing cap just a little bit to make sure that I'm not going to have the line rub up against that. It's got a nice profile to it, comes up here. It's not touching anything the entire way. I put my lights up there. If this thing vibrates, it's not hitting anything. So this is set up perfect. I love this setup right now. So now we're going to check backlash again. I just want to see where we're at. And we are at 7.5, maybe almost 8, which is good. It kind of pushes us towards that 10 a little bit. And now what we need to do is paint some teeth, and we're going to run another final pattern. And this time I'm going to paint teeth in 3 different spots because I want to make sure that I have a good pattern all the way around this ring gear and we're not having any other issues somewhere. And now we're going to compare these to the old pattern, and that looks pretty darn close. So I'm really happy with that. That's going to be the final setup with this once I verify that those are as close as I think they are. And that is all there is to installing an ARB into a Salisbury axle. Fairly straight. With the locker all finished up, now all we have left to do is install the airline up to the compressor. All right, that does it for the ARB install on this thing. As you can see, it's a very similar process to my other re-gear videos. You just got to make sure that you get everything lined up, measured out where it needs to go. In this case here, using or reusing the gears that were in there, we just wanted to make sure we get that, that backlash close. We wanted the pinion depth to be exactly what it was. We were able to reuse those pinion depth shims, accomplish that. The backlash was the only thing that was a little bit tricky within 1.5 to 2 thousandths. But again, we replaced the bearings, which will change things. And I'm perfectly happy with where it's at now because on that, I believe we had it at 7.5 thousandths or 8 thousandths, something like that, that those bearings are going to break in and it's going to open back up towards that 10 thou backlash, which will be running in that area that it was when it first got in here. So again, perfectly happy with the install. Gonna get this thing back to the owner, back on the road. If you want to learn how to install an ARB air compressor, I'm gonna do that next, but I'm gonna make a separate video and I'm gonna do it on this thing right here behind me. So look for that video in the future and we'll see you next time.